issues. It is a Delhi-based NGO working to promote safe, inclusive spaces that advance people's well-being and their agency over the sexuality in SRHR. We do this through information dissemination, capacity and perspective strengthening, cultivating platforms for conversations on sexuality and well-being. Also want to say this year is a bit special for us because Tarshi is turning 30 very, very soon. So we are celebrating 3 decades of holding space for conversations on sexuality that are nuanced, inclusive, and from a pleasure-affirming lens. Like I told you, we do a lot of information dissemination conversation platforms. One of our key platforms for doing this is In Plain Speak, our digital magazine. The magazine is also quite old as us. It used to be a print magazine, and now it's going to be 12 years of it being a digital magazine. And the objective of the magazine is to nurture a safe, inclusive, and positive space to generate awareness and on conversations that are difficult, sensitive around issues on sexuality, and promote sexual and reproductive health and rights and well-being for all. We do an issue every month with themes that spread across 2 months. And for April and May, the magazine dives into masculinities and sexuality. This issue brought together a range of voices from across the region and a spectrum of experiences. And today's webinar is an extension of these conversations that happen. I'm just going to go into a little bit about the theme of the April-May issue of In Plain Speak before we actually start the webinar. So masculinities broadly refers to the set of attitudes, behaviors, expectations commonly associated with men or male power in a given culture. Masculinities are not only performed by people with male-assigned bodies. We believe they are varied across time, factors such as caste, class, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and so on, and are not fixed and unchangeable. There's a whole spectrum of masculinities from those that might be affirming to those that also might be considered toxic. So there are different kinds of masculinities that often come and interact with each other. They might come in conflict with each other. Some might be considered more powerful, hegemonic, and others might be subordinate or marginalized in any given location. And in this webinar, we are just here to figure out, okay, how does this develop and, how this expression plays out when it comes to our sexuality? So what are certain factors that produce certain kind of masculinities? Are the performances that we do or experiences that we have of masculinities different in public or private spaces? So this webinar looks into, looking into some fascinating interplay of masculinities and sexuality. And I'm very glad that we have been able to do this and really excited. And just want to thank you again for being here. I am going to hand over to Gayatri now to formally take the conversation forward.
Thank you so much, Nandini. A very warm welcome once again to everybody for joining our webinar today called Beyond the Here and Now, the Changing Contours of Masculinities and Sexuality. My name is Gayatri and I work at Tashi as a program associate. And I will be moderating the conversation along with Nandini today. All right, so let's begin by getting to know our speakers. We have with us Shudipto Das and Ishan Mahindru. Shudipto Das, they go by the pronouns they and them, is a Dalit queer feminist writer and communications professional working at the intersections of sexuality rights and gender justice. They are currently the Senior Communications Officer for Asia at Girls Not Brides. As a freelance writer, their work is deeply rooted in the lived experiences of those directly affected by social inequalities, offering insights into the complexities of social justice in the Indian and South Asian contexts. Welcome, Shubhi. Thank you for being here. We have Ishan Mahindru. He goes by the pronouns he and him. Ishan Mahindru is a PhD candidate in comparative literary studies at Northwestern University. His work looks at how women writers in South Asia develop a poetics of unfulfilled love and friendship to critique dominant frameworks of religion, caste, and the nation state. He has previously written on a broad range of topics including masculinity, sexuality, translation, and friendship. Thank you for joining us, Ishan. Now let's move on to the round of questions. So there would be 3 rounds of questions, followed by an activity round. and I would be asking questions to our speakers alternatively. There will be some links that will be shared in the chat by Anukya simultaneously. So please keep a lookout for those as well, and they will be interactive. So I would request everybody to also participate. Okay, so to begin the round of questions, Shudipto, I would like to take us back to the article that you wrote for us in the Masculinities issue for In Plain Speak. So, in your article, you talk a lot about your changing relationship with masculinities. So, I would like to ask you, what do masculinities mean to you today, and how does your identity as a queer person shape that meaning? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, and hello everyone who is listening to this conversation. Um, I have not reflected on this particular question, though I got the questions before. But I think masculinity, gender, sexuality are things that I have been thinking about for a long time. Um, and it has always been complex. And I don't think that it's ever going to stop being complex in terms of my relationship with sexuality or masculinity or gender identity. I don't also aspire arriving to a destination where I will have complete clarity that this is what exactly it means for me. Um, and as I have written in the piece also, the moment trans people or non-binary people, they express their masculinity or femininity, it's always met with a lot of suspicion, right? Like people constantly doubt if you're masc enough or femme enough. And for me, being a AMAP person when I was growing up and I was more assertive being a trans femme person, if I could or would exhibit any maskness, a lot of people would also look at me with suspicion that if I'm really a trans femme person, or if I'm really a non-binary person or not. The relationship or the gaze of how people look at my masculinity or femininity definitely has shifted over time. But for me, I think it has also been very interesting that I started working in the social justice space in 2017-16, right? It has been a long time. And since a lot of my articulations, because I was not an English speaker, I started reading a lot of content online. I came across a lot of articulations that were happening in the social justice space. I also realized so much of this articulation also happens as a response to the anti-gender, anti-trans discourse, right? The moment they say that, oh, like there is only man and women, there are only two genders, we respond to that saying that no, there are definitely more genders, and eventually it becomes a response to what they are saying. That's one part of the kind of conversation that happens here. But the other part also has been that a lot of time working in the social justice space or working with civil society organizations, most of the sessions that we conduct on sexuality or masculinity, we call them sensitizing workshops or perspective building workshops. And most of the time, by default, we imagine that the audience is going to be cishet people mostly. And what happens with that, that we simplify the discourse. But from my own lived experience, I know that my relationship with my gender, with masculinity or femininity, it has not been simple. Um, so the language is really limiting for me. Over the time, now that I'm in my early 30s, I have resources. I also have access to a lot of conversation that have been done by veterans elders. I have also access to a lot of other people. I think I look at my masculinity more curiously, and I also try to see what does that really mean for me. Because I can call something masculine when I'm practicing that, but other people might find it still feminine. So how do we also look at each other and how do we comprehend each other's gender expression? That's always going to differ. So over the time, I think it's also becoming much more personal for me. It's becoming much more sacred. I'm not only sort of looking at this experience from the perspective that people are not going to believe me or trust me, or they're going to look at me with suspicion, or there's going to be threat if I am more femme or more masked. I'm slightly trying to sort of stay away from that, which of course comes with certain bit of access to privilege now that I can do. When I was younger, I could not. When I was living with my native family, I could not. So I'm also coming closer to my more authentic self. And perhaps that's the space I'm most comfortable in. And while I'm not chasing meaning, I think I'm also very tightly holding on to the meaninglessness that I write about in the piece.
Thank you so much, Udito, for answering so honestly. Like you rightly said, identities are something which are very subjective and very personal. And to navigate between a space like that, um, it is not easy to like deal with it on a personal level more than like putting it out there into words and like for other people to interpret or see. And I love how you beautifully said that you're exploring your masculinities or like looking at it very curiously. That's so well put. Thank you so much. So moving on to my question to you, Ishan. So in your article, you talked about a novel by Amrita Preetham called Dilli Ki Kaliyan, to explore the ideas of masculinities. So, is there any other work by the same author or any other literature that has shaped your understanding of what masculinities mean, particularly in relation to sexuality?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question, Gayatri, and to Tarshi, and congratulations to all of you for doing this for so many years. And I'm honored to be a part of this conversation and excited to be a part of it with Shudipto as well. Um, I don't even remember the first time I heard Amrita Preetham's name. It must have been so many years ago, but I have been consistently reading her work for a decade now, her novels, her poems, and her essays. And she's a very well-known woman writer, but I think when I approached her work, I was also hesitant of bracketing her within that category. That is, even if I read her as a woman writer, I wanted to see how her unique worldview helped us understand a broad range of issues. And she talks about rural and urban settings, about state politics, and our everyday intimacies as well. And she is also primarily an author of love stories, which is also something that attracts many readers to her work. Um, One of her most famous writings is, of course, on the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947. And the novel that I'm currently working on and thinking about is
Lakjana,
called Pinjar.
Lakjana, yes.
I'm sorry, I think somebody's mic was on.
Yeah,
But
mommy.
yes,
I'm sorry. Could everybody please make sure that their mics are on mute so that we can have a interruption-free conversation? Thank you so much. Ishan, you could proceed.
sure, no worries. Um, yeah, so the novel that I've been thinking about is Pinjar, and if people know about it, if people don't know about it, the reason that that novel strikes me as so relevant is, of course, that at the time of partition, there was widespread sexual violence, and both Muslim, Hindu, and Sikh women, they were targeted for religious and communal reasons. And I began rereading this novel again about a decade ago, around which time, again, thinking about masculinities intersectionally, um, there was this bogey of something called the love jihad conspiracy that was going around. And what we saw that while Muslim women had been endlessly victimized for many decades across the West and across the South Asian subcontinent, what we saw now was a curious phenomenon where Muslim men were especially villainized as well. And so it was actually uncomfortable for me to revisit this novel because it's a story about a Hindu woman born in a Sahukar family named Puro, who's abducted by a man named Rashid, who's born in a Sheikh family. And I specifically mentioned Sahukar and Sheikh because although these are religiously coded names, they're not as simple as Hindu and Muslim. They're really landowning families, and class and caste play important factors over here. The abduction in question also occurs decades before the actual partition of India and Pakistan, which shows us how Preetham is saying that the problem of sexual violence is something that predates our current moment as well. And that is something that we need to keep in mind instead of looking at things through just one particular historical lens. But let me pause there and just maybe read a portion from the Hindi version of this novel. And this is after Puru has been abducted, has been living with her abductor for a year, and bears a child, a baby boy to him. And the child is placed next to her to be fed. And Puru is thinking, and Puru says, um, पूरो के मस्तिष्क में एक विचार घूमने लगा। यह लड़का, इस लड़के का पिता, सब पुरुष जाति, पुरुष, पुरुष, जो स्त्री के शरीर को कुत्ते की हड्डी की भांति चूसते हैं, कुत्ते की हड्डी की भांति चबाते हैं। लड़का पूरो का दूध पीता रहा। पूरो का मन रहंड के डोंगों की भांति भरता और खाली होता रहा। Now the English translation by Khushwant Singh. This boy's father, all mankind, all men, men who gnaw a woman's body like a dog, gnawing a bone, and like a dog consuming it. The boy continued to suck at his mother's breasts, while Hamida is Puru's Muslim name, Hamida's mind continued to fill and empty like the buckets of a Persian wheel. Now, what is clear while I was reading this novel is that there is a binary between the Hindu and the Muslim, the Sahukar and the Sheikh, the man and the woman. But what also became clear over the arc of reading this story is that that gendered binary is somehow being complicated, it's being undercut. And suddenly we see a much more complicated picture of Rashid the abductor as well, who is burdened by the pressure of upholding his family honor, of upholding his sort of class and caste status, and who is also overcome by the shock and grief of his actions as well. And in the course of the novel, he undergoes a psychosomatic shock almost. And Puru has to nurse him into health again. And while she does that, uh, she says this to herself. पूरो का मन करने लगा कि वह सचमुच भूल जाए कि रशीद ने उसके साथ बुरा किया है। वह रशीद को बहुत प्यार करने लगे। रशीद उसका पति था। रशीद उसके पुत्र का पिता था। बस यही एक सत्य था और सब कुछ झूठ। Puro wished that someday she actually forgets that Rashid had earned her wrath, that she might truly fall in love with him. Rashid was her husband, he was the father of her child. That's all that was true, and the rest a lie. Now, I don't want to glorify or valorize what Puro, Preetham's character, says here, or how she tries to make the best of her very miserable circumstances. But just to point out that then, as now, when masculinity was extremely unlikable, was extremely loaded with the baggage of toxicity, it was still possible um, for men to relate to women and for women to perhaps negotiate the hurt and violence that they felt in these circumstances as well. And so Preetham's entire oeuvre of her writing is really about overcoming these binaries of both Hindu, Muslim, Sheikh, Sahukar, provider, caretaker, man, woman, and finding a more expansive vocabulary to understand uh, both that women can and have expressed their desires and have also expressed their desires to say no, for instance, and express their consent in a varied uh, way, but that men can also experience love, hurt, and vulnerability. Um, and there's multiple other poems that perhaps I can read later, but I think I'll end with reading a brief quote from another novel by another writer, Krishna Sopti. And she's a Hindi writer, and she's written this beautiful novel called Dilo Danish, which is a sort of beautiful love story between a Hindu lawyer and a Muslim, his Muslim mistress named Mehek. Um, and they have an affair, sort of an extramarital affair going on, and after some time, he stops showing up at her place, and she expresses her hurt and resentment for being ignored by him in this manner. And so the lawyer is thinking this, वकील साहब झुंझुलाए तिलमिलाए फिर सिर हिलाकर कहा जानम मोहब्बत की रिहाइश सिर्फ जिस्म में नहीं दिलो दिमाग में भी होती है। महक ने आंख न झपकी और बड़ी अनोखी आवाज में कहा दिलो दिमाग क्या काया के अंदर नहीं होते? So this is the English translation.
Ishan, you're on mute.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I think I heard some other voice. But I don't know which part did I break off at, so I'm just going to read the English translation again. Um, Vakil Sahib got agitated and angry, then shook his head. Janam, love does not merely reside in the body, but also the heart and the mind. Mehek did not blink twice before replying in a striking voice. To the heart and the mind not reside inside the body. So, just to make it clear, when I'm talking about men embracing love and vulnerability, I'm not talking about an unearthly love, a poetic ideal that is far removed from the banalities of our everyday life. I think if masculinity has to look at itself self-critically, it needs to shift from its epic ambitions, its almighty omniscience, and any kind of philosophical pretension it has of being all powerful, and seeing itself, in a more mortal way, perhaps. And there are many other examples, but just to pick on these two women writers for now, and maybe get us going.
Thank you so much for your answer, Ishan. Of course, Amrita Preetham ji has been a very well-known and a renowned writer when it has come to South Asian literature, specifically with respect to like Indian and Pakistani ethnicities. And she's written some wonderful essays as well as poetries. Um, I have also followed a couple of poetries by her, and for me personally, the take that you brought forward through your article and through what you said right now, in terms of how uh, masculinities, need to be more vulnerable in a sense to be able to be explored fully, or they need to interact and probably resonate more with women, so to say, according to what the essence of the writings by Amrita Preetham has been. So I feel that is something which is going to take the discourse and the concept and the developing concept of masculinity is forward, and you know so yeah, thank you so much for that. All right, so moving on to the second round of questions. So over here, I will ask you both to read an excerpt each from your respective articles, and I'll be asking a question related to that. Before that, I would like to announce that there is a Menti link that will be shared in the chat box by Anugya, and it has a prompt which says, "Share one word you associate with masculinities." And I would ask everybody to add their responses in that link. We will wait for a minute so that you all can answer and then proceed with the questions. And don't think a lot, just simply write the first thing that comes to your mind on reading the prompt. And Shivito and Ishan, you both are also welcome to carry out this exercise. So, yeah, let's wait for a minute. All right, so I hope most of you have answered the question. If not, you can continue doing so while the conversation proceeds. Uh, all right, so Nandini, could you please share the excerpt on the screen? All right, so Shubhito, I would request you to read the following excerpt and then I'll follow it up with the question.
Yeah, sure. I'm still sort of soaking in how beautifully Shan read some of the quotes from the stories. They're such beautiful quotes. And I'm also requesting everyone to go back to the article and perhaps read the entire thing that I have written on Plain. I'm not sure like if this particular sort of excerpt is going to do justice to the entire thing that I have written. So yeah, I'm reading this out. In the revolutioning of discourse and narratives around masculinity in social justice spaces, men can be feminist, they say. Men should cultivate soft masculinities. These words are reiterated. And by soft, they mean gentle, emotional, responsible, empathy, crying, melting men, but never feminine. Rather than dire attempts of making masculinity soft, softer, softest, why can't we ask men and boys to be feminine or just make everything a bit meaningless, unpacking both to an extent where they, femininity and masculinity, heartbreakingly lose charm?
Thank you for reading, Shubhito. It's amazing how full of emotion this is and also so well articulated. So, my question to you is, could you share more about what meaninglessness means to you in the context of this excerpt? And how do you see this as a direction for possible future conversations on the intersections of masculinities and sexuality?
Yeah. Again, I want to reiterate that how I'm curious about what this meaninglessness really means. But I'm personally really invested in the potential of really unpacking this meaninglessness. So when I was writing, also I remember I was in Hyderabad and I was thinking about the way that we speak about masculinities in social justice spaces. And I was also broad thinking about who are the actors primarily that we have who think about structuring or restructuring conversations and discourses around gender identity and masculinities. Media definitely has a lot of influence. There is enough and quite some conversation that happens in academic spaces. But again, there is not enough access to those kind of spaces, right? And then, unfortunately, fortunately, social justice spaces are spaces where there is a lot of direct efforts are being put where conversations around these things are happening. Um, and there is value in that, right? Like when we are talking also to the actors in the social justice spaces directly and how we are speaking of masculinities and social justice and gender identities. While the critique how oftentimes civil society organizations can de-radicalize and depoliticize social justice issues, um, at the same time, there is direct reach to people in the grassroots, in communities, in a lot of other spaces where we are engaging with conversations around gender identity. In a lot of these conversations, as I was talking about, there is this attempt of creating meaning and there is this attempt that where we are also trying to soften masculinity, we're trying to create beautiful masculinities and in a way glamorize masculinities, uh, but not in a conversations perhaps where we are also trying to getting into the roots of it, that what does this exactly mean? And what are the social norms and stereotypes that comes with the moment I say that this person is masculine and this person is feminine? If I talk about my own gender expressions, if I tell someone that I'm non-binary, for me personally, I think that also essentially becomes an information exchange where I'm trying to tell the other person that this is how I want to be treated, this is how I want to be regarded, right? But at the same time, I never want to invite any unsolicited sort of stereotypes that they want to attach with the information that I have shared with them. I don't want them to imagine that, oh, like now that I have told that I'm non-binary, this is the only way that I can act. So that expectation is really scary for me. I think that's really limiting. Um, and at the same time, I feel that that creates an environment where there is not enough flexibility where we can truly be ourselves. So when we are also conducting such kind of sessions in the communities, in the grassroots, um, we are not talking enough about the meaninglessness that this masculinity or femininity or this information exchange that truly has. Sometimes people do have questions, right? That what exactly a trans woman means or what exactly a trans man means. And because those questions also comes from the other side, we try to articulate and give a working definition. But I think as people who are also trying to sort of critically look at the discourse, it's important that we break down those definitions and end of the day, we also create space for certain kind of ambiguity. The information can not only go from the civil society to the community or the people in the grassroots. There is a lot of information and ideation that also comes from the other side. So the collective imagination of this meaninglessness, um, I personally don't think is yet happening. In my writing, I also write about how there is enough conversation in these kind of spaces, how gender is a social construct, but not yet enough conversation how perhaps bodies, who is a man, who is a woman, is a socio-medical construct, right? We are not speaking about it because, of course, like this becomes a complicated conversation. We do not have language to articulate a lot of these things. Language is also evolving. Our own understandings of wellness, masculinity, and sexuality is evolving. But still, I feel that collectively we need to really uh, create spaces where we are sort of shaping and breaking this meaninglessness. Um, the moment we are working on masculinities, I feel that it's queer rights work. The moment we are talking about comprehensive sexuality education, I think it's queer rights work. But unfortunately, there is not enough acknowledgement yet. There is not enough acknowledgement of the socio-political queer frameworks that queer trans people in the past that have offered. And our entire curriculums and the way we conduct the sessions are, in a way, built upon that, right? And as a result, what happens a lot of times, these conversations are not led by queer trans people. So the expansion and the meaninglessness is not being created in a way where it is informed by the realities of queer trans people as well, which is very important. I feel that work around masculinities or the construction or the distraction of meaninglessness cannot happen without having queer trans people at the front. Um, and I'm not saying that queer trans liberation is the ultimatum. It's going to liberate all of us. It's not. We still have to talk about caste justice. We also have to talk about elitism. We have to talk about disability justice and many other things. But at the same time, I feel that looking at queer transness only in terms of its presentation or who these people are attracted to is a very limiting way of looking at the potential. We also have to understand the kind of socio-political framework that has been offered by queer trans people in the history or in the present or perhaps in the future, and how they also show us that how we can exist in non-normative ways, how the worlds can be run, how societies can be formed, how families could be, uh, you know, uh, be in a space, or how we can love people, we can love friends, we can love lovers, and everything in between. So there is a lot of radical possibilities that we offer. At no point I am strongly or very strongly advocating for a post-gender world because I am personally not yet very convinced about it. When I close my eyes, I can't really imagine what a post-gender world where gender is completely abolished. It doesn't hold any meaning. It looks like I cannot imagine that. It has also been critiqued by a lot of trans people where we know that how oftentimes binary trans people or trans people are also looked at people who reinforce gender stereotypes. And suddenly, the entire responsibility of this meaninglessness is thrusted upon with trans people. And when they uh, reaffirm or like sort of uh, uphold a lot of gender stereotypes, they are looked down upon. So that is why I am not yet convinced about post-genderism, and it's also primarily a philosophical idea, right? I cannot imagine how it's going to be translated into a real world. But at the same time, I feel when queer trans people are leading these conversations, this imagination, there is a lot of potential in it. And especially when we are doing this on ground with real people who are yet not arrested by language and its expansion and limitation both, and they are not uh, yet only, in a space where they're only using certain kind of language, which, to be honest, if I want to say that I'm a victim of. Uh, Oftentimes people ask me that, are you from academia? Which I'm not. But the way I speak, oftentimes, the way I write, oftentimes might appear that it's academic writing or academic articulation because most of the language that I have borrowed are from those spaces. But aspiration wise, I feel that I definitely want to simplify. I want to uh, have more resources, more content where we are talking about this meaninglessness in a much more loose way, in a much more fragile way, allowing gender identities, gender expressions, everything to break down, lose a bit of charm, lose a bit of meaning, and we all collectively looking at it curiously. We might not also be doing it because we are not immediately looking or finding an incentive in doing that kind of work, and rightly so, right? In the current socio-political environment where, again, the anti-gender, anti-trans sentiments are so strong, so difficult to suddenly say that, oh, like, let's imagine the meaninglessness of gender. It's difficult work, but I think there is value because until and unless we don't do it, we are delaying a process, we are delaying a world where maybe gender justice or a world where people can be themselves. Um, we are sort of pushing that away. So I'm also tempted. I'm also personally really curious how that world is going to look like. But I also understand the personal failure that I cannot do it alone, or my friends can't do it alone. We need more people, and we need to collectively do it.
Thank you so much, Shubhito, for your answer, and completely in agreement and in acknowledgement of everything that you said. And as you rightly mentioned, that as people working in the social sector, or people who are talking about issues or topics related to identity, gender, sexualities, I believe incorporating meaninglessness, like you described it, in the language, itself that we choose to use, would definitely be a helpful measure to divert towards taking these conversations about masculinities forward, or for that matter, any kind of gender or any kind of sexuality, because. At the first hand, I think if there is acknowledgement of the lack of understanding, or of the lack of um, any kind of labels or terms that you don't have for you have for um, addressing these issues, would sort of grant some sort of respect to people who don't understand it or understand it differently, without actually violating any individual's identity or the way they choose to express themselves. And then we can move on to understanding or comprehending them further. So thank you so much for that. Now, Nandini, could you please share the excerpt from Ishan's article? Right. Ishan, I would request you to please read the excerpt, and then I'll follow it up by the question.
Right. Thank you so much. Um, I would like to think that this confusion that men are left to grapple with, while welcome, has always already existed for many of us. This confusion has, in fact, been the root of a lot of violence and hurt, precisely because dominant culture has offered a singular paradigm for masculinity. A paradigm that is quote unquote toxic because it is hegemonic, in that it rules out the possibility of a masculine spectrum, disallowing a range of people who identify as men to express themselves in a manner of their choosing. Perhaps then, what should prove helpful in all of this confusion is recognizing that masculinity has been imbued with a diversity of lived experiences.
Thank you for reading. So, Ishan, could you talk a little more about the confusion that you are referring to and the possibility of a spectrum of masculinities?
Sure. Building off, I think, a little on what Shudipta was just talking about. When I wrote this article, it was a while back, and I yet begun, hadn't really committed myself to academia in a way that I have committed now. And of course, there are obstacles to navigating academic language, but what academic language has helped me do is also push down on critical thinking, really, or lean into critical thinking. And I think as long as the workshops, the sessions, the webinars, all of these little things that we do are a passage into critical thinking, we are actually indulging in a truly academic exercise um, as well. And I think my experience of writing this article then came at the back of doing similar workshops, excuse me, um, that left me with a lot of confusion, and that also led me to encounter confusion among participants that did identify as men as well. And just to give some examples of the kind of workshops that we were conducting, these were workshops that were specifically meant to talk to college students in college campuses, undergrad college campuses, about the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act, the POSH Act. And we wanted to expand the conversation beyond thinking about law and lawmaking to really understand why is it that consent, for instance, is perhaps not hard to get, but something that is so unfamiliar to us as a concept in our everyday experiences vis-a-vis sexuality. So some of the reactions that we got in these workshops, they were perhaps more predictable, which is that uh, some men were aghast at the things that they had to consider now all of a sudden in light of the kind of discourse that had developed post the Me Too moment. But also many of them were just kind of surprised to discover that the language that they had been using had been homophobic or transphobic, for instance. And after many of these workshops, I had like male participants sort of walk up to us and just share really intimate details about their relationships, for instance, and ask me if what they did was right or not, or if what they did constituted harassment or violence, and if it did, what else could they do? They were really just curious, but also really confused, and really just wanted a yes or no answer from me as to what is the right way or ethical way of acting in relation to any of the women in their lives, but also just people generally. Uh, I remember there were also just reactions that were riddled with surprises, right? So we conducted these workshops for not only students but also staff members in multiple professional settings. And there was a librarian, I remember, who was I mean, if this doesn't sound ageist, was like slightly old or slightly middle-aged. And he was just surprised at the kind of terms we were using in front of him, instead of using highly Sanskritic vocabulary, we were just talking about sex as maza, or talking about consent as ijazat, for instance, or just moving between languages and also using colloquialisms, and perhaps even playing an item song or two to talk about objectification and pleasure and ecstasy. And he was so surprised, and at the end of the workshop, he came to us and he said, "इस काम को तो आपने धंधा बना रखा है." And he was so surprised that one can actually have a job just talking about these things as well. And then I think one of the most memorable reactions I had. This was at an undergrad college in a fairly elite campus in North Campus in Delhi University. Um, and we all know how sexual harassment committees, internal complaint committees, I think, work in these settings, right? They're not really all that helpful to victims or survivors, or even friendly for any kind of student to approach. In fact, the moment that some of these committees get a complaint, they just call the complainant's parents and sort of infantilize them and tell them that they should, focus on work and not indulge in all these other things. So really, they do not respect a specific grievance, for instance. Um, and in these workshops that we hardly got permission to do in the first place, professors and principals insisted that they also attend, which also limited the scope of our conversation with students and the kind of honesty that we could expect from them. But I remember one of these professors who was sitting in these workshops, and she was trying to articulate a question, but really measuring her words. And she was saying, what do I do, for instance, if, for instance, I run into a classroom and I see a boy and a girl, and they're sitting in an, and she really hesitated before using this word, in an objectionable pose. And I wasn't clear what she meant by objectionable, but even before I had an opportunity to answer that question, this boy who was sitting at the very last row of the class sort of got up all of a sudden and very angrily said, "How do you know it was objectionable?" Uh, and and I realized that what was happening at that moment was that we were talking about harassment, about filing complaints, about like addressing asymmetry between men and women in an environment where even consensual sexuality was taboo, right? And so that really hindered the kind of vocabulary that we could develop for talking about mutuality or desire, for instance, to go back to some of the points that Shadipta was raising as well. Um, and so these were the questions that sort of were in the back of my mind when I tried to talk about masculinity and in relation to some of the literature that I was reading as well. Um, and maybe I can talk more in detail about some of the points I make in that article. But since then, I think coming to academia has also helped me develop a more fine-tuned uh, vocabulary to understand some of the masculine anxieties that we are really thinking about and dealing with over here. Um, so one of the schools of theory that I often turn to is psychoanalysis. And one of my favorite theorists is Jacqueline Rose. And Jacqueline Rose has a very nice book called Feminism and the Abomination of Violence. And she has an essay by that name in this book. And over here, she borrows from a range of resources, philosophical sources, psychoanalytical resources, and she talks about, to borrow a phrase from Hannah Arendt, an impotent bigness. Um, and it's such a delicious phrase to actually think about uh, where does masculine violence stem from? And we often think that masculine violence is an extension of the power that men enjoy, and sure it is. But really, at the heart of that violence is an anxiety. And that anxiety is about revealing the fact that they are not all powerful, that there are limits to their power and there are limits to their knowledge. So, what Rose encourages us as a way of dealing with, for instance, masculine violence, is to encourage a kind of thinking that admits to the vulnerability of that power, that admits to the limitations of that power, that admits to the fact that we do not actually consciously know everything that we want at a moment. And therefore, we must enter into a kind of conversation with both ourselves and the rest of the world about this unknowingness, or as Shudipto was saying, this meaninglessness as well. Um, I don't know if I have more time, Gayatri. Can I add something to that?
Yeah, sure. If you could quickly. add?
Yeah. Okay, if I have to be quick about it, then I'll just say that there are many examples that again Rose uses in that essay, but one of them is a case study of a boy who is, and this is in the middle of the Second World War, so he's plagued by nightmares of uh, the opposing country invading his country, but he's also plagued by nightmares of his father because his father is beating up his mother. And he really does not know, of course, if he can do anything about it. But there are moments when he both identifies with the father and then is fearful of him. And what Rose traces in that study is that those moments in which that question or that path is open to him as to whether he reproduces the sort of example that is being set up for him by his father, or whether he questions it and does something different that might be confusing, but at the same time, he can lean into this confusion and actually take himself to an unpredictable and unimaginable terrain, as opposed to just following the example that his older brother or his older father is setting for him as well. And I think that was, again, like one striking example that kind of stuck to me and took me back to the workshops that I was conducting pre-academia in some way as well. And yeah, I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Ishan. All right, so I will quickly move on to our last and final round of questions. Before I move on to the questions, there is a poll that will be put up in the chat by Anukia, which will basically ask you what kind of content that in Plain Speak offers would you all like to engage with. So I would request everyone to please answer. Now, for my last question to you, Shadipto, you shared this deeply personal piece through In Plain Speak. So, how do you think spaces like this and a platform like In Plain Speak can contribute to carrying forward conversations about masculinities forward, especially, say, from a trans and non binary perspective, since they often get left out?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I'm also trying to think back what was the when was the first time that I came across Plain Speak, and I want to say it was perhaps the same time that I started working in the social justice space. Because this particular resource, I think, has always been very important. And when we think about vocabulary, when we think about language, as Ishan was also talking about how academia brought a lot of language to them. All of us struggle across different kind of languages when we have to articulate our experiences of desire, sexuality, gender, all of it, right? And when I was also thinking about meaninglessness, I was also thinking that how it has been part of our history, queer trans history, because the other day I was also reading this Bengali magazine, which is by queer trans people. And Professor Anuruddha Datta talked about their interaction with one of the important queer trans figures in Bengal, Bakpada, who is not with us anymore. So in their interaction with late Bakpada, Oni also talks about how a lot of times in the 90s or early 2000, Bappada used to refer themselves as a gay man, sometimes as a she-male, sometimes as a transgender person, and for them the language changed with the context or what kind of spaces they're occupying. While we are currently in a space where we are constantly trying to separate everything and box everything, and we want to know, okay, this means that or that means that, the overlapping or the meaninglessness, again, that's a word that I'm going to come back to, is not something that we tap onto enough. While I feel that Plain Speak has been one of the spaces which actually have showed that there is not one single way of speaking about queerness or sexuality. There are many ways of talking about queerness and sexuality. Um, we struggle with data a lot, right? Because a lot of our lived experiences are not recorded. A lot of what we say are oral memories. They have not been archived. But Plain has also been one of those interesting spaces where a lot of our narratives has been archived beyond the binary of right and wrong, as just experience, as just opinion, as perhaps an opinion when I wrote about it, and down the line somebody might look back and this is just going to be my opinion as a Dalit non-binary person, nothing beyond that. Maybe it's not going to, the politics might evolve and people might start speaking about this particular thing in a completely different way. But it's also very important and reassuring for me to look back and read something which has been written about 10 years ago. And Plain has been around for that long of a time, right? Where many people have written about their many experiences. Um, to me, of course, like it's also gotten a lot of vocabulary language to articulate a lot of things, which also becomes important to occupy space. Uh, though I also want to say that I still struggle with language, right? Because uh, I don't think that that's that's ever going to be uh, a solution for me because colloquially, like I speak Bengali, then I speak Hindi, then I speak English, and different languages, I articulate my experiences differently. When I came to also like in metropolitan, like I used to live in the outskirts of Kolkata, but when I shifted to Bombay or like in Delhi, a lot of time many people wouldn't really understand the terminology koti, which is a colloquial terminology for AMAB, trans feminine people, right? And growing up used to articulate our experiences with that one identity. But here people would understand non-binariness more. So we also had to adapt. We also had to sort of make those changes. But I think PlainSpeak also has been one of those spaces where I think a lot of these regional realities were being represented because I have read about them on the website. So I think it's very important that we archive these experiences. We also archive them with the politics in heart that, again, there is not one way of speaking about masculinity or queerness, and there shouldn't be ever.
Thank you so much, Aditya. Very glad to know that in Plain Speak is making that kind of a contribution. Uh, all right, so Ishan, my last question to you is, since you wrote this piece back in 2019 for In Plain Speak, looking back now, how have your views evolved since you wrote the article? What has changed in your thinking or in the world around you? And what, if anything, still remains the same?
Right, thank you for that question. I think I did talk a little about how my views might have changed or evolved, or I acquired new vocabulary to talk about the same things in my last response. Um, which is, but yeah, it's been a while since I wrote that article, and uh, as writers, I don't know if other people connect with this, but every time that we go back to something that we wrote a little while back, I immediately cringe. And I think that cringe is good, though. I'm admitting to some vulnerability and learning on my own part. Um, and I feel that there are ideas over there, definitely, that I latch on to, especially what I said about confusion, what I said about embracing a spectrum of masculinities, for instance. Um, but there are ways of conducting that conversation, I think, that could have been better. So one of the things that was running in my mind, and Shadipta talked about this, is that we often talk about when we talk about masculinity, about thinking about masculinity in a softer way, for instance, or as an alternative to a toxic masculinity. And that was very much the discourse, I think, that was going on at that point of time. But I felt, of course, that doesn't solve the problem. It just creates another kind of set of norms and rules for us to follow. Like the men who are coming to me at the end of our workshops and asking, okay, what do I do now? It was this technocratic sort of need to know that they needed to fulfill and really possess knowledge and hence again possess some kind of power and some kind of confidence in how they navigate the world when really what we should do when we question masculine norms is think about uncertainty, is think about confusion and meaninglessness, to go back to some of the words that have been coming up in our conversation. And so what I've tried to do through this webinar is also correct some of the things that I thought I was inadequate uh, in doing so in the past, and really pay attention to the language of the novel itself, and see where in that language can we open up moments of questioning and interrogating ourselves as well. So to go back to Dilli Ki Galiyan, for instance, one of the examples that I did not mention in my article originally was of so Dilli Ki Galiyan is a novel about a woman journalist navigating her professional and personal life in Delhi, and the many encounters she has with different men, some sort of past boyfriends, some poets that are trying to chase her, who write horrible poetry, and also sort of persecute her and sort of assassinate her character in public. And then this really sensitive artist with whom she eventually develops a kind of mutual relationship. But there's also this sort of unknown figure who kind of drops in at the end of the novel, who leaves her all of these anonymous tips, some of them about, the kind of planned harassment that she's facing and that he overheard about and wanted to like alert her to. And ultimately, she says that thank you for these tips, but I don't want these tips. I don't want your protection, but I want to know who you are. So come and meet me. So he comes and meets her, and they have a very sort of rich, poetic conversation. And he says, "Yeah, I'm just a nobody. I just, hang out at the railway station adda. I read a lot of books. I read your columns, and whenever I find something that interests me, I note it down in the notebook. But I'm not really a writer. I'm not really a thinker." And then she turns to him and she says, if I'm remembering this correctly, the line is, "आपको देख के याद आता है कि कुछ कवि ऐसे भी होते हैं जो जिंदगी भर कोई कविता नहीं लिखते." And I was struck by that line. And this is something that I think, again, a really good writer and critic to turn to, Paramita Vora, talks about that when we talk about reimagining our educational spaces, be it through these workshops, such as the sex education workshops that we conduct, or just education more broadly, we need to develop a more poetic approach to our inner lives. And in so doing, perhaps open up a space for a different kind of conversation than the one that we have flowing right now, where we just replace one kind of problematic paradigm with just another good paradigm. Because that doesn't really solve anything. It creates another sort of set of expectations that then we are burdened with upholding. So maybe I'll pause there. Yeah.
Thank you, Shan, for your answer. And yeah, definitely your poetic lens is something we would love to have in our approach towards almost everything. Okay, so before we move on to the last segment of our webinar today, which is an activity, I would like to thank Ishan, you, and Shadipto, you, for your patience and the nuance with which you answered each question. Thank you for taking us into your life experiences and giving us insights with so much of vulnerability while talking about a developing concept like masculinities. Now we are moving on to the activity segment, and I would like to hand it over to Nandini.
Okay. Hi, hope you all can hear me, and thank you so much for sticking till now. And like I already mentioned, too much to observe and so much to reflect and think upon on the topics or nuances that Ishan and Sudipto touched upon. And now we wanted to create a space where we hear from all of you about what you think about this topic. So for that, I just want all of us to zoom out a little bit and do some imagination in your head. So imagine that you are in the year 2047 and you wake up one morning in a future where the world has transformed. Now, for the better or not is something that you can think about, but the world has transformed in 2047. You step outside, maybe you're in a city with a lot of traffic, you're in a quiet rural town, maybe a queer commune, or even a virtual reality pod in 2047. And you begin to notice, what kind of conversations are people having, or what are the ways people are expressing care, desire, their identity, or what are norms uh, that are shifting. Some that used to confine us would be shifting, some are still existing. So, what is this world like in 2047? So, there's a world where, masculinities and sexuality could be free, could be fluid, could be safe, could be joyful, or a world which is still pretty much like what it is now, right? Where we might be struggling, there might be some wins, might be some losses. We would still be struggling to be who we really are. So just breathe and take a couple of minutes. And what I want all of you to do is just to think about what world would you like in 2047. So how would you like masculinities and sexuality to shape in 2047? So I just want you to hold on to this thought and think a little about the world we wish to create in the future. So I will pause for a while. And just want to say this is a safe space, it's a non judgmental space, and we encourage as many diverse ideas and thoughts that all of you have. So please don't hesitate to share whatever you're feeling, if it's for the better, if it's not, if there's some, um, thoughts that you're still processing, which are all okay and welcome in this space. Okay. So, as we are all reflecting, we just want to create a space where you can either unmute and share your thoughts on what would the world look like in 2047, or how would masculinity and sexuality be shaped in 2047. So we welcome if anybody would like to unmute themselves and share their imagination with us. Or please feel free to also use the chat box. Please put your thoughts on chats. Like I said, don't have to be articulated, don't have to be, maybe always positive or negative. It's completely upon you. It's a safe space. But yeah, we would love to hear from any of you what you think or what your imagination would be. Just for just for clarification, and thanks Anugia for putting it. I would like if somebody wants to speak, if they can raise their hand. So if there are multiple people, we can coordinate accordingly. So anybody who would like to say something, or even any thoughts that you have from what Ishan or Sudipto might have shared, or obviously you can use the chat box as well. Somebody shared how every small contribution is to be recognized and valued. Thank you so much for sharing that. Somebody shared no rigidity in how anyone identifies. Maybe wish for that in 2047 for sure. Any other ideas, thoughts that you have about the topic? Somebody said it reminds them of the piece by Rukeya Begun, Sultana's Dream. Also talks about how sexuality education curriculum workshops are very integral in every school and college. I think, yeah, a couple of things that our speakers shared were very relatable, and everybody was like, yes, this happens in classrooms, or there's so many anecdotes where we like teachers have certain opinions of how sexuality plays, or even masculinity plays within classrooms, and that's a space that conversations are also very important for young people who are shaping these ideologies. So thank you, Ujjwal, for sharing that. Oh, I got too many comments now. Okay, someone says how they have to be accepting of various forms of masculinities grounded in values of empathy and respect. Yes, thank you so much. I think very recently in our office, we're talking about, if there was a time where hegemonic would replace to something that again becomes popular, or what would that replacement be? So it would be interesting to see, what is powerful in 2047, or could be a completely different narrative that we spin around. Someone said they'd like for there to be a shift where we celebrate our gender and sexuality to a point that no one feels the need to come out, that people will be able to be fluid, explore their gender or sexuality freely without judgment, different cultures, non-binary trans identities and the traditions that are erased. Thank you so much sharing that. Someone shared about communities, breaking stereotypes. Someone shared about pushback for inclusivity, healing, and equity. More plural. Yeah, thank you so much. They're very, very interesting ideas. And I think our aim for this was also how most of the conversation that we have around masculinities is mostly in that box of toxic. And we sometimes can't move away from that label and imagine what is pleasure affirming, or what could be pleasure affirming, right? Or what could be different ways of masculinities that can be exercised. So thank you so much for sharing. We're short on time, so we'll come to an end. But yeah, encourage people to continue writing on chat. Before we end, I just wanted to once again thank our speakers and also the ISL interpreters, Manisha and Atul, for making this event accessible and for being there and for patiently interpreting everything that we have said, and also to Sudipto, Ishan, for bringing in your reflections, imagination, um, you know, ideas to this space today. And I think what we want is, we don't want the conversations to end here. In fact, we love for them to go further. And we wanted to share a little bit about how all of you can contribute to In Plain Speak. So, In Plain Speak is always looking for new and diverse voices. So, even if you are a seasoned writer or you're just starting to write for the first time, we would love to hear about you. Say something about sexuality, gender, pleasure, relationships, bodies, identities, anything. We would love for you to pitch us any idea, article, poem, photo essay, or even a doodle that probably captures your thoughts. Anogya will be sharing a link on chat which has more information on how you can submit our submission guidelines. And there is a call for submissions for the issue language and sexuality. So if you feel like there was a lot of conversation on language also in this webinar, on how we struggle to find languages that are affirming or that truly talks about how we want to identify ourselves, or is relatable to our experiences. So any thoughts that you have, we'd love for you to contribute. And if today's session gave you something to think about, so like a new perspective or a quote you love or a moment that stayed with you, we would love for you to share it on LinkedIn or any social media platform that you use. You can tag Tarshi, use any hashtags that you would like, or even if you have any feedback on how we can make the webinar more accessible, what kind of other things that you want to hear from us, or any feedback that you have in general of the flow and how it has been organized, we would encourage you to reach out to us. You can email us at intenspeak@darshi.net. Yeah, so this is it from us, and thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope that there are more conversational spaces on sexuality and well-being. So take care, and we'll hopefully meet once again. Thank you to the speakers, and thank you everybody for being here.
Thank you, everyone. This is great.
Yeah, thank you so much for staying back for such a long time.
Thank you. Bye. Have a good
Thank
week.
you, everybody. Bye bye.